Good evening. I'm Derek Worker, and on behalf of the New Press, I would like to thank you for joining this conversation and for helping us to celebrate the publication of Chris Lombardi's I Ain't Marching Anymore, Dissenters, Deserters, and Objectors to America's Wars. Chris Lombardi is a journalist who has been writing about peace and war for many years. Her expertise is imbued in her new book, which has been called enlightening, vivid, well-written, and thoroughly researched. We're thrilled to have Adam Hochschild joining her in conversation. Hockshield is one of our great storytellers and has written about tyranny, human rights, social justice, and war. He is the author of 9 books, the most recent of which is Rebel Cinderella, a biography of socialist activist Rose Pastor Stokes. For those participating on Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature to pose questions to our speakers and can use the chat function to chat with other fellow attendees. We'll be sure to share links to both of their books in the chat, so stay tuned for that. And with that, I pass the screen to Adam and Chris.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here and get to talk with you, Chris, about your book, which you first told me about, what was it, 10, 12 years ago? We met at a conference?
2006.
2006, okay. And before then, you said the book really got born in that famous class at Columbia that Sam Friedman teaches, right?
Yeah.
So you've been thinking about it for a long time, and you've obviously been working in this field for a long time because you worked for the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors for a while, right?
5 years.
Wow. Okay. So this is a book that really comes out of your life experience and something you've been thinking and caring about for a long time. And I think that's why I found it so gripping. Take us through, I mean, here this book is sort of a survey of dissent against America's wars over really more than 200 years. Some of it was unfamiliar to me, and I thought I ought to know something about this because I was involved in the movement against the Vietnam War, and I've written about war dissenters and so on. But you go right back to the beginning. And on page 2, I'm reading here, you have a quote from a guy named Ritter. I want you to tell us about him, who says, "It is contrary to the divine will for a Christian to fight." And he said that in the midst of the Revolutionary War, am I right?
In the middle of the Battle of Brandywine.
Okay.
September 11th, 1777.
Okay.
I mean,
So
it's funny, the book starts on September 11th and ends kind of with stuff arising out of September 11th.
So we've had these dissenters in our military right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Now, in the Revolutionary War, there was no draft, right? So there were really there was
some conscription. There's some conscription towards the end of the war.
Huh. Okay. Were there other dissenters then?
Well, it's complicated because, of course, in some ways the war was dissent, right? Dissent against the British.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me that the culture of that time, these were people that had been reading John Locke and that stuff. They had a sense of who a citizen was. They had a sense of what their rights were, and you had soldiers who believed in electing their officers, and they had 3-year terms, and they would leave once your term was over, and they would tell their officers, "You can't do anything to me," and that kind of thing was going on. And a lot of stuff happened because, in general, soldiers back then, as we all know, were very badly paid, and they were drawn from, as now, from the part of the society where they have fewer resources.
Yeah.
And so it's a class rebellion.
And then the next war you deal with is the War of 1812, where we had a dissenter who was half black, half Native American, and he protested, if I remember correctly, both against the War of 1812 and against the Indian Wars. Am I right about that?
Well, he was very aware of what happened to his people. Mm-hmm. When he signed up, he was thinking, "My God, am I going to fight for these people who took my land away?" And he became one of these sort of preacher types towards after the war, and wrote books about it. And at one point, his father, the Pequot father, told him, "If you want to do something, you should go and work on behalf of the Mashpee, the tribe that got some publicity recently in a court case." And he then fought for them. He met William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, and in the 1840s.
Wow.
He was fighting on behalf of his people all the time, and his books were very powerful that way. He went from soldier to storyteller, which is the other arc that happens a lot.
Huh. It is so moving to sort of think of these currents of dissent running through our history, because for the most part, that's not the American history that gets celebrated and taught in our schools. There were dissenters from the Mexican War, which was a very imperialist war. Tell us about that.
Well, that was one of there was no conscription there. It was all volunteers.
Yeah.
And it was very frankly fought by slave owners and promoted by slave owners to expand the country to get more slave states. And that was, people were aware of that right from the get-go. And what was interesting to me about that was the number of dissenters from inside the military that wrote about it later, or wrote about it even in letters. And meanwhile, the whole change is going on.
Fighting for the slave owners rather than doing something more patriotic. Is that why they were dissenting?
Well, yeah, considering, I mean, one of the people I talk about a lot is Ethan Allen Hitchcock, whose his grandfather was a Revolutionary War hero, Ethan Allen. And I call him Hamlet of American expansionism because he had a lot of trouble with the Indian Wars. And then he went to Mexico under orders and said, my heart is not in this business. Eventually, he ends up being asked to fight the Civil War, but at that point, he's old and he's like, I'm not going to do that. But that was the only way he could believe in. And the other one, the Mexican War, there's also Nicholas Trust, who was a West Point cadet, who left West Point. He was a protege of Thomas Jefferson, and he was the reason that we got the Treaty of Guadalupe.
And
because Polk hired him to. His dissent was Polk told him, "Come home. I don't like you anymore because you're being too friendly with the Mexicans." And he said no. And he negotiated a treaty with them. Now we given away half their land, of course, a good portion of it, but there were a lot of people in America who were saying, "Let's get all of Mexico." And there was a very controversial treaty. Unless when it's finished, there were enough people saying, "Wait a minute, the war's over." And his mother was very anti-war too. I think that was part of it.
And didn't Abraham Lincoln dissent against the Mexican War?
He did.
When he
was Ulysses Grant too.
Yeah. Okay. It's a good reminder that all along in American history, we have had very public dissenters against the wars that the country has been involved in. Now, when we get to the Civil War, I was where, of course, there was conscription on both sides. One thing that startled me was what you wrote about is the number of deserters on both sides. It struck me as just extraordinary.
I mean, I always say that the Civil War kind of flips the table over, because you've got people who are in the Union Army to see themselves as fighting status quo. Slave power is so powerful that the southern states had control of the economy, and they were fighting to save the Union, but they were fighting in slavery, and they saw themselves as trying to create a new world. You had deserters. You had deserters who didn't believe in ending slavery, and that's the one that we all know about. The New York City draft riots, and I live in Philadelphia, and central Pennsylvania was deserter country, and there was a huge number of people who just left the Union Army that way. The Confederacy, that was happening a little later in the war, but you had a lot of people who just came over to the Union side. Some people didn't not manage to write about too.
Yeah. I guess there was more of a temptation to desert in that war because people were fighting within their own country rather than being sent overseas where there's
Well,
no.
yeah, because your mom's so not far away. Yeah, this
Yeah.
whole what's now called post-traumatic stress disorder was originally called nostalgia.
I couldn't quite hear you there.
No, it's now called PTSD.
Oh,
Used to be called, was originally called nostalgia.
Nostalgia. Okay.
And it was a longing for home. And then during Civil War, they started calling it soldier's heart.
Soldier's heart.
That's how I find really.
And this is what later came to be called shell shock, and
yeah,
then bad fatigue,
and then battle fatigue, and then yeah.
I like that phrase. I like that phrase, soldier's heart. Best of all.
I think it's great. It was the idea was that soldiers' physical hearts were being harmed by the wars, by the trauma of war, and that turned out to be sort of true.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the processes of the hormones that happen in PTSD.
Yeah, yeah. Then the next war, then were there any dissenters against the Indian Wars in the second half of the 19th century? I mean, dissenters from within the U.S. military.
There were some.
Draft.
There's not many as we would like there to be. But there's two threads. I think the most famous one, of course, I always talk about is Silas Lowell, who he was someone who fought with John Brown before the Civil War. But he ended up in the 2nd Colorado Infantry, and he was basically enforcing the Indian Wars. And he when they were about to have a massacre of the Arapaho, he said no. And he left. He ended up testifying before Congress about it. He exposed it.
Wow.
He's the only one that I can. There was not a lot of documentation about others who said no.
Yeah.
I mean, the thread all the way through, you talk about when the Trail of Tears happened, and all the removals were happening.
Sorry, when what happened?
When the removals were happening, Trail of Tears and all that. There was objection to that, and there's one book called View from Officer's Row. It was about young officers talking about their experiences, and they were very torn. This guy named Grierson, who was a white commander of black troops, and he was fighting for justice for them, and he was also so passionate about Indians that they called him a Quaker.
Wow. Then we get to the Philippine War, which is one that has long fascinated me because it was the first time, but unfortunately not the last, that this country got bogged down in a land war in Asia. And there, the real dissenters were the black soldiers, especially this guy, David Fagan, whom you write about, who actually deserted and went over to the other side. And as I recall, nobody knows what eventually happened to David Fagan, except that he was seen fighting with the Philippine rebels, right?
He was. He made name an officer of some sort. But you have to also talk about the black soldiers who wrote letters to the black press tell them what's going on. And there's the role of Lewis Douglas, Fred Douglas's son, who wrote this very passionate editorial about I'm losing my thing. He said that Americans bargain with the Negroes is always not good, and right now they're asking blacks to do this war for them, and it's not right. Yeah,
because black troops played a big role in that war, and I'm not surprised that they rebelled, because I mean this was a war where the Filipinos originally expected that the United States would come in, whip the Spanish, and then give the Philippines their independence. And of course, nothing of the sort happened. It turned out the U.S. wanted to turn the Philippines into a colony. It was also a war, of course, like the Iraq War, where there was a big torture scandal.
The invention of waterboarding. The invention of waterboarding developed by the military started there.
Yeah.
And there were hearings about this in 1902.
Mm-hmm.
And as often happens, soldiers talking about this, they were very measured about how to talk about it. They didn't always say this is terrible, but the fact that it was happening was exposed a lot of things. And general saying this can't happen, this can't be.
And it was talked about before Congress. It was talked about in newspaper articles, and I've even seen photographs of Filipino guerrillas being waterboarded.
Oh yeah, I haven't seen those.
Yeah, there are a couple of them. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, this also is something which is not new. Then we get to the First World War, which is a war that has long fascinated me. I've written about it before, and I'm in the middle of writing about it right now, where there were a lot of conscientious objectors in this country who were treated really horribly. Tell us something about them and what happened to them and what the country's attitude was. How many were there? There were about 500 or so, weren't there?
More than that. I think it was 5,000, I think.
Oh.
And they were mostly from peace churches. Mm-hmm. And there was, at that point, no organizations fighting for them. Mm-hmm. And there were, like you're referring to the fact that Evan Thomas, for example, held up by his arms.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. And
arms shackled to the cell bars for 8 hours a day because you were supposed to be working 8 hours a day. And if you weren't working, you were shackled in that position. Yeah.
And there were also some bunch of objectors inside the military, and that was getting started there.
Some what inside the military?
COs inside the military being medics. That was getting started there.
Yeah, because there, as I remember, there was no, that if you pleaded that you were a conscientious objector and your draft board did not give you an exemption, you were then treated as a soldier who was refusing to obey orders, sort of a deserter within, but within the army.
And that was something that Evan Thomas, for example, took as a point of pride. Mm-hmm. His journals are very interesting because he got the camaraderie of basic training. He was having fun. Mm-hmm. But he meant that he was doing this so that he could stand up against war more directly.
Yeah. And he was the brother of Norman Thomas.
Yeah.
And there were two other brothers who were actually in the military in Europe. Am I remembering that?
Only one. I think there's only one. Ralph.
Okay.
And actually, who was it? The other Evan Thomas's grandson, his great granddaughter, in a book about the two brothers.
Yeah.
And during the war.
So, and as I look back on it, the First World War was responsible for so many things that went wrong with the 20th century. I don't know, I've always had a special place in my heart for the people who objected against that war, because in some way they foresaw, I think, what it was going to do to the world. Then the period after the First World War, we had Smedley Butler speaking out. Tell us about him.
Well, if you talk about the bonus march is a good way to start with that.
Yeah.
And we're talking about class issues between soldiers and veterans. And Smedley Butler spoke at the bonus march, and I think about that. That after World War I, soldiers who came home, the Depression was happening, and they were not being treated well. and they started to organize and said, we want a pension. And thousands of them from all over the country converged to Washington, D.C. And so this film of Smedley Butler, who had fought in the Philippines, saying, you guys are the only leaders of the country.
Okay.
Smedley Butler, like Norman Thomas, actually ended up as a Socialist Party leader, which is interesting.
Are you seeing, by the way, there's a message in the chat, Chris, asking you to speak a little more slowly because
Yeah,
they
I will do that. Yes.
trouble with your mic.
I'm sorry. I need to talk more slowly always.
Okay.
I've always had this happen. So Smedley Butler, his career starts in the Philippines, and we know his famous speech, "War is racket." He says that I have fought on behalf of United Fruit and all these corporations named saying I was not fighting for the country. And his career ended with him supporting the Socialist Party, which is interesting.
Amazing. I wish there were more generals like that. In World War II, there were thousands of conscientious objectors, but as I recall, they were not treated as badly as the ones in the First World War, right?
Certainly not. That Center on Conscience of War, which is an organization that I'm on the board of now, was founded in 1940. And all the peace churches got together saying, we have to make sure this doesn't happen again. And they created these camps. They were called civilian public service camps. And if you look at what happened then, basically the whole progressive movement that followed was kind of nurtured there. The guys were doing experiments, they were doing farm work, they were doing all kinds of stuff. And there was also segregation, however, and that was a real problem.
Yeah. And then the next real war, of course, is the Vietnam War, where you must have known some of the resistors there.
Well, you can talk a little bit about my what started all this.
Yeah.
I was working for the Center for Community for Conscientious Objectors, and I was answering this thing called GI Rights Hotline, which you guys probably know about, GIRights.org. And this was in the early 90s, and it was just getting started. And suddenly, I've been hired to work on this organization, Ted Magazine, and suddenly I'm talking to soldiers every day. And we ended up with a team answering those calls, most of whom were Vietnam veterans. Ended up saying, wait a minute, if it's going to be a revolution, it's going to be led by anti-war veterans. These are people that have experienced the shit and have an idea of how to fix it. So I knew a lot of Vietnam veterans, and actually, when I started in this book class, I called one of them, Steve Morse, who I don't think he's watching this, but he should be, and said, I'm writing a book about you. He was someone who had been a conscience objector, a Quaker conscience objector, and joined the army so that he could organize.
Joined the army so that
he could organize against the war.
So that he could organize within the army.
Yeah. Spent a lot of time in the stockade and ended up invading Cambodia and shooting at the ground.
Well, I also learned something from your book about an occasion I was at, which I didn't know at the time, at the demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations at the Democratic National Committee meeting, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, 1968. I was there demonstrating, and I remember the National Guardsmen who faced us with their rifles and so on, people putting flowers in the ends of their rifles and so on. But I didn't know until I read your book that 43 National Guardsmen had refused duty that day.
Yeah, absolutely.
What happened to them? Were they punished?
43? I don't remember what happened to them. I know that they were African Americans, and they were like, we're not going to be turned on our city. We're not going to do that.
Yeah.
There's the resistance inside the military was so massive that sort of as with now. Actually, I put a picture of the 443 up on Instagram when National Guard was being deployed against the protests. So this is something that has a strong history.
Yeah, yeah. So, and then of course, as you point out, there were also dissenters against the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Afghan War, the wars that are still in one way or another going on today. Although we don't hear so much about them, I think, because, you know, there isn't a draft. Let me sort of finish this line of questions by just asking you something that people have sometimes asked me. Would it be a good thing if there was a draft? Because it would, in fact, cause much more public protest against the wars that we're engaged in right now than we have seen.
I mean, I got asked that at a podcast a couple weeks ago. And the first thing I thought of was the fact that, in general, when we had a draft, people with low privilege got out.
Mm-hmm.
That the poverty draft is just reifying what's already happening.
Yeah.
And most of these wars we talked about, the majority were enlisted.
Yeah.
So I don't think it would make that much of a difference. I think that, especially now with the way that the technology is, it would be even more easier for the privilege to get off.
Probably, yeah. You'd have to have a draft that was really fair and scooped up absolutely everybody with no exceptions.
I mean, I'm sort of. It's funny because I started all my whole life on this. I went through a very brief libertarian phase, and I was against the draft because I was against of any kind of service. And now I'm a big fan of national service, and I could see having a draft that allowed people to do something other than war.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Rebuild the country, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. There are a couple of questions that have come in for you. One is, could the speakers talk a bit more about what motivates somebody to take a stand against war rather than against the individual privations of war? Any thoughts on that? And then I have some thoughts on it too.
So too many thoughts. I'm trying to think now. Talk to people who were, when I was talking to cell conscious rejectors in those days, the people are just see what's happening and realizing that I'm not going to. This is wrong. Then the story here. Let's do Jacob Ritter. Let's do that guy from the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually not from Peace Church. He was a Lutheran.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw what was happening and saw that people were bleeding and dying. And he was just seized by feeling that this is not something that people want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And taking a stand against war is realizing what war is.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many ways to realize that. Jeff Patterson, who I think may be watching this, Gulf War resistor, he was a Marine. He was on service in Okinawa, and he was reading about what America was doing in Central America and other parts, and saying, "Wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense."
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to figure out what he wanted to do, and then the Gulf War happened.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Okay, I'm not going to do that anymore." Sometimes you learn about what war is, and that's how you do it. Yeah. And you make a decision that your personal safety is not as important as taking a stand.
Yeah.
I mean, the bravest people I've ever known. Bravest people I've ever known.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me there's sort of people resist war for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it has to do with the politics of the specific war. Sometimes it has to do with an experience that somebody has when, they're being ordered to do something like, kill or inflict injury on a civilian or something that seems immoral to them. And then sometimes I think people look around and see what the war is doing to their fellow soldiers. And it's as much a resistance to what war does to the people who are fighting on your side as it is to thinking about what it's doing to the people that you're supposedly fighting against. And then, of course, some people, it awakens some sense of conscience which they had that was kind of dormant for a long time, but it's taken an experience like this to really awaken it. So, okay, other questions coming in. What sorts of things did your callers raise with you? I'm not sure what callers.
One of it, the GI Rights Hotline.
Oh, this is okay. So this was on the GI's hotline. This was like during the 1990s.
1990s, yeah. I left in 2000, and I think if I'd stayed another year, I probably would never managed to leave, because after 9/11, the GI Rights Hotline kind of exploded. But you'd have people just saying it feels wrong, and sometimes people would call and say, "I think all I want is out," and talk to them a little more and figure out what problem they're having with it, and you realize that, I mean, being a conscientious objector is actually the hardest thing. It's easier to get something out of the military if they've have a medical problem, if they have a family issue. There's another things you can work on. But DO it's a very long process, and people have to sort of look into their beliefs. So the first they're calling because when they're unhappy, and or they're calling because they know their COs. It's hard to know. It's hard to be generalized about it. Because I got both kinds of calls.
Yeah. What is there a single call or something that sticks out in your memory from that time?
My very first CO I think about, because and it was, I'd only been doing the hotline for a fairly short amount of time. It was actually a couple who were they were fluid, and they both decided that what was wrong, and I had to work with them. The process goes, you have to come up with a very, very complex application, and you have to have a psychiatrist, talk to a chaplain, and then you have a hearing, preparing them for the hearing. And they both got out. I was very happy with that. I mean, since they're unconscious of war, they get all these calls all the time. And Maria, who has my job now, said that what keeps it going is the fact that sometimes you win. But it's Mike and Evelyn.
I couldn't quite hear you. What keeps her going is
sometimes you win. Sometimes it's the fruit.
Yeah. Okay. Another question that's come in here is, what could our current military do now in protest, in opposition to what they're told to do? When discovering that the murders that they're told to do, when it finally hits them, that indeed it is the murder of innocent people. I presume this is talking about what's happening in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria right now.
That's when you contact an organization like CCW and say, I need help, and you'll start going through the process. There's military regulations that say that if your beliefs have changed while you're in the military, you can try to get out, and there's a place for this to happen.
Yeah.
And it's complicated and it's hard, but sometimes you can end up appealing to the military's highest court, Armed Court of Appeals, and it means that way. Amy Allison, who's been famous lately because she started an organization called See the People that organizes Black women. She was a Gulf War objector, and her case was decided by but it went up all the way.
Mhm.
But the answer, if someone that you know is in the military is starting to think that what's happening is wrong, they should reach out.
Mhm. Yeah. One of the things that sort of most disturbs me about the situation we're in right now is that so much warfare can be carried on without people. You know, it is drone strikes. It
Remember,
is,
drone strikes are run by people.
that's true. That's true. But I mean, so few people
Yeah,
can
yeah,
carry out so much damage.
that's true.
Have there been cases of drone operators and so forth coming to anti-war organizations and saying, I want out? Because I understand that's
Bradley Bryant,
stressful.
yeah, reality winner. Bradley
Mhm.
Bradford Bryant, who was one of the people that kind of there's a movie called Drone that's out there, and I believe National Bird, and you'll see some of the people who came forward about this.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And under the Trump administration, some of those people have gotten say, retaliated against.
Huh. Yeah. Um, are you expecting more whistleblowers from inside the military and inside the intelligence organizations? Because that was certainly something that was tremendously important, you know, during the Iraq War.
There's some of that happening right now, but Werner Farage wrote this article about whistleblower that
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
there's an
This,
article in the New Yorker right now about a whistleblower
huh.
against the CIA
Uh-huh.
manipulating the military.
Yeah.
So they're happening, and it's. I think that I have a feeling that I'm hoping that books like mine will help raise the
Good.
profile and make people more understand why they're doing what they're doing.
Good. Well, I'm certainly hoping that too. Um, my own experience of the Vietnam period, though, makes me think that there is something um, about having a draft, no matter how unequally it is applied. And you're absolutely right that there are always privileged people who are going to be able to pull strings and get out of it and so forth. But the fact that it's there, I think during the Vietnam era, forced people to come to terms with what their country was doing in a way that they probably would not have, or at least not have done so quickly, had the whole war been fought with a volunteer
I
army.
would say quickly. It took them
Well,
15 years.
that's true. That's true. But the
They did
protests,
it did intensify the organizing. You're right.
yeah, the protests though began pretty quickly
Yeah.
and lasted for some time. And I kind of contrast that with the Iraq War, where when it began, there were huge marches, protest marches, and I took part in one of them, and I'm sure you did too. And then it kind of faded away because um, nobody's family members were being forced to fight this war.
Mhm.
And I just wonder if it would have been different had there been a draft. I mean, I hate to advocate a draft because I don't think most wars should be fought at all.
Yeah.
But just thinking about its relationship to,
I mean, thinking about how movements are building, talk a little bit about that. I think that what the last 10 years or so have taught us is you can't have movements that sort of flare up and flare out. That the movement has to always be going on.
mm-hmm.
And, you know, I talked to somebody a couple of days ago about the fact that when Obama was elected, the anti-movement that existed went poof.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody was anti-war anymore because not that they were in favor of the war, but they're like, you know, everything's okay now.
Yeah.
And I think that having been through the last 10 years, when after the drone war started and all that, people organizing against what the military is doing has become more of something that people are doing more of. I think, I don't know. I mean, I can't say because I did not live through draft calls every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I can't say that you're wrong or not.
Yeah. 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 I see somebody is writing in on the chat here. I'm in the military and I'm working to try to get the Defend the Guard Act on the agenda in my state.
Defend the guard as to protect the guard against being deployed.
I don't know what that means. Whether he meant to write or she meant to write defund the guard? I'm not sure what that is. Is there a Defend the Guard Act that you know of? Huh. Okay.
Whoever
Well,
asked, tell us some more because I don't know. Defend the Guard Act.
yeah, I'm not sure what that's about.
Mhm.
I mean, there's also an issue that came up some weeks ago about when the Trump administration was talking about using the Insurrection Act to use the military to put down Black Lives Matter protests in the U.S. And then we had the sort of odd position of the military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Defense Secretary thinking that this should not be done.
Yeah.
And in fact, that was why Trump just fired the Secretary of Defense. So is that something that you would anticipate arising again? Probably not under Biden, but farther down the road?
It's hard to know because the resistance on the part of the generals is always so partial.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, thank God the first person that I admire most in that particular wave was a young man named Adam Navarro, who was a member of the National Guard, who testified before Congress about what happened in Lafayette Park on June 3rd.
Yeah.
And that this was not the oath that National Guard people take is not about this. And he did it under the auspices of the Whistleblower Protection Act. Protection Act. And
well, he's certainly operating in a long tradition, which your book makes clear. I'd like to encourage other people with questions for either of us to put them in the chat, and we will try to answer them. Here's the information on the Defend the Guard Act. The bill would have prevented the West Virginia National Guard from being deployed in any foreign conflict without a congressional declaration of war. The ACLU supported it, but it failed in the 2019 session. That's a very interesting bill that I had not heard about, and very sensible that Congress, because that forces Congress to declare war, which Congress hasn't done for decades. When was the last time Congress actually declared war? Was it World War II?
I think so. Yeah, Korean War was not a war; it was police action. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Now here's a question which I think you're more qualified to speak on than I. Speak of the evolution of legal recognition of conscientious objection in the US from starting off as a sort of pass for members of the so-called peace churches to broader recognition, expanding the definition from belief in the supreme being to being opposed to war in any form.
Well, the first thing I need to mention is Seeger versus US. Which was in 1965 when we had a Supreme Court we liked, and that established that you didn't have to believe in God even to be a conscientious objector. If your belief in against war had the force of religion, if you could do that, and that's how you end up with all these conscientious objectors during Vietnam, doing all this alternative service, and the military. The business military COs has evolved slowly, I think, since before World War I, and then I think through the way that things work in the military, bit by bit, case by case, things change. And I don't know when this business of the crystallization point started. The idea that a drafted person could change their mind. But it happened before 1970 because that's when Fred Marchand, who is one of the people in my Vietnam chapter, who is a professor at Suffolk University in Massachusetts, you may be watching. He was a Marine who, when My Lai massacre happened, he looked at the pictures and went, "Oh my God, is that me?" And he was the adjutant general, which is a legal officer at a base in Okinawa. And he turned around and looked at the regulations and went, "Oh, I can do this." And there was already a body of regulations that allowed him to do that. So it's something that the legal definitions haven't altered that much for civilians. And with the military, I think it evolves. For example, we have Muslim COs now.
Objecting to all war or objecting to war when it's against?
Has to be all war. Has to be all war.
Okay, it has to be all war.
There's no selective objection. People have fought for that.
Yeah.
But right now, it's still you have to be opposed to your personal involvement in any kind of war.
Yeah.
And if they ask you, "What about Hitler?" you can say, "Hitler is not directing me right now."
Yeah.
So I can't tell you what I would have done with Hitler.
Yeah. I mean, here this sort of fits in with one question that came in the Q&A here, where it says, "I can imagine some circumstances where war is acceptable, but these cases would be very far and few between. Certainly not the wars we face now. Could I qualify as a conscientious objector?" And
possibly.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to talk to someone who and talk about. It's quite possible. It's have to have a conversation with somebody.
Here's somebody who asks, "It's fascinating to hear that some members of the military protested the events in Lafayette Park. Could you say a bit more, like what consequences they faced?"
Actually, I think that Edmund Marco did not face any consequences. He was acting under the Whistleblower Protection Act. I don't know about individual members of the National Guard who may have refused it, but I was talking about this one guy. I think that my understanding of the J Rights Hotline people is that they're getting calls saying, "I don't want to do this. I don't want to be deployed against my community. What can I do?" And there are lots of materials being developed for people in preparation.
Yeah. Someone else asks, "What can we do to support conscientious objectors today? Are there particular organizations you would steer people to?"
Center on Conscience and War, which I think Eric has already put in the chat. centeronconscience.org. It's the one national organization that does conscience objectors, that supports conscience objectors. Now, J Rights Hotline also, there are a lot of people supporting COs and those organizations, member organizations as well.
Okay. I'm looking for other questions here. Congratulations, Chris. Super proud of you. You've been formally at work on this book since 2006. Back then, we were 5 years into the Afghan War, 3 years into the Iraq invasion. How did you imagine the conclusion of those wars back then? And how did you imagine the book back then? So did the nature of the book change?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the original proposal, my deadline was 2008. So it was just about the Bush Wars. And it was going to be relatively simple in some ways. The original proposal also, I only had one chapter for all of up to the 20th century. So I ended up going deep, and my idea about what we're fighting for, what people are fighting for, and what people are fighting against, it has changed. The need to talk about the Indian Wars and about the wars against racism. But that was something I was not originally talking about.
Another more general question. Congratulations, Chris. I'm fascinated by how authority works and how it fails. Did you learn anything about this process and how figures in command lose their authority? That's a big question.
It is, but I don't tend to spend a lot of time thinking about figures in command. That's just not my interest. My interest is more on the ground.
So no particular thoughts on that.
Figures in command, that's sort of general. Thinking about, for example, who's our authority? Again, thinking about My Lai, actually, and about the fight to even expose what happened there, and the way that, again, you had Private Thomas Glenn, who wrote to Major Colin Powell saying it's happening, and Major Colin Powell said, no, it's not. And the evolution of that, between that, and that's how somebody's heart is lost.
Yeah.
When they're proven liars. And that didn't happen to Powell very much.
Yeah.
It happened to a lot of people in the Vietnam situation.
Is there anybody at the level of Colin Powell who, looking back at Vietnam, feels really differently about it and has said so right now? Because he was wounded as a young officer in Vietnam and went on to a long career in the military and in the government. And you always wonder, these people, how do they look back on it now? You ever find anybody like that who really questioned their judgments at the time? A Smedley Butler for our time.
Yeah, and at a high upper level.
Because Smedley Butler was what, a major general or something, right?
Yeah.
Nobody like that we can find for.
I can think of. I mean, in terms of people, I think of are all lower level. People who prosecuted the war, you have Meth Westmoreland, who didn't suffer any consequences. And Robert McNamara, who has done the whole did the whole I'm so sorry thing. Some of that. Robert McNamara did that.
Yeah, it's strange, but it was a very calculated, very calibrated I'm so sorry. He was both sorry and not sorry, it seemed to me. And it was very hard to figure out exactly what he was sorry for. I know that he took part in meetings between, 40 years later or whatever, between people who were in authority in Vietnam at the time the war was going on and people who were in authority in the United States. And
someone who in comments pointed that Larry Wilkerson, who was an aide to Colin Powell, is now very, very clear about what was wrong there.
Yeah, that's true. And he was a colonel, right? Yeah, but his dissent was against the Iraq War, basically, right? Wasn't it?
He's been known about that recently, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's interesting to see him asked about that, asked to write about that. It's a good question.
Let me see if there are some of these questions I think we've answered already. But I'm just looking to see if there are any others that have come in. Well, one person is asking about resistance in the Army during the Vietnam War, soldiers attacking their sergeants and their officers and so forth. Is that something you would hear much about when you were talking to Vietnam resistors?
Not a lot, but it was obviously, it was crazy situation. Everything was happening. See a movie called So No Sir, and there's also a book called Soldiers in Revolt. The fracking stuff.
I didn't hear that. So No Serve?
Sir, no sir. Sir, no sir.
Okay.
Which is a movie that talks about everything happening there.
Yeah.
And there were fraggings, there were sergeants killing their commanders, all that stuff was happening. That
Yeah.
was not what I was covering for the most part, because I was talking more about explicit dissent. But it was
Yeah.
happening. It was crazy time. Again, it was the war going on forever.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we are coming up towards the end of the hour, and there are some more questions, although a lot of them look to me like things that we've already covered. Do you have any sort of final thoughts, Chris?
I want to answer Michael Lenn's question first. Talking about the impressive efforts of people in the military to organize against racism, and that's a true. I just wrote an op-ed piece that I'm trying to translate about there's a long and noble history inside the military and inside veterans organizations around that.
Mm-hmm.
You can talk about, again, you talk about the Philippine War and go on from there. And certainly during Vietnam, there were rebellions. And I also don't want this thing be over before talking about Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin gets into my book because Bayard Rustin.
Oh, Bayard Rustin, yeah.
He qualifies in the book because he dropped out of ROTC. He was a Wilberforce University. So he qualifies verily for the book. And he was a World War II conscious objector who went on to, he was a mentor to Martin Luther King.
Right.
He organized, in between there, he was part of the committee against Jim Crow in the military.
And wasn't he the sort of major organizer of the 1963 March on Washington?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he was gay. And that's one of the reasons that it took a long time for him to be recognized.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, very, very much a hero for our time. Okay. Well, I think we've answered most of the questions that have come in. And I think I just want to end by urging everyone out there who hasn't already done so to buy Chris's book and read it. And I'll hold it up one more time so you can see it here. I ain't marching anymore. Derek, you're holding it up too.
Thank you. Yeah.
And Derek, any final words from the New Press, which publishes a lot of other good books as well?
Yes, no, lots of other books. I would just suggest people check us out at thenewpress.com, and we will follow up with an email as well to everybody that's attended. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Adam and Chris, for talking to us about the book, about soldier dissent, and so many other things.
Speaking of that, there's one final question comes in. Is the book available in audio or other alternate formats, meaning ebook?
There's an audiobook, but at tantor.com.
Okay.
Tantor.
Yes.
And search for
audio and an ebook from various vendors.
Good. Okay. Good.
Also, Adam, tell your story. Tell your Vietnam story.
Oh, all right. Well, you were asking me what I did during the Vietnam War. I tried to avoid the draft by joining the Army Reserves, because then you just had to be on active duty for 4 months and be in the reserves for 6 years, which meant you went to weekly meetings and drilled and so forth. And because the Pentagon knew that the reserves were full of people like me, who wanted to avoid going to Vietnam at all costs, they never called up the reserves. The US fought the 4th largest war in its history without ever calling the reserves. And we organized a group of reservists and National Guardsmen against the war. We marched in demonstrations. We had lawyers in our reserve units who could tell us what was the legal line we could go up to, which was that, if you're in the Army and you refuse to obey an order, there are dreadful consequences. But if you say, I would refuse the order to go to Vietnam if it was given to me, there's nothing they could get you with. So we signed petitions, we held press conferences and so on, talking about that. And I published a newsletter for our group, which was called Red Line, which was a play on words, because if you missed a meeting of your reserve unit, you were redlined. Your name was crossed off, and you got penalized. And red line is also a term in technology where if a machine, rotates or spins or something at beyond a certain number of revolutions per minute, it reaches its red line and may explode. So that was what I did during the Vietnam War, and happily never got called up, never got sent to Vietnam, and wouldn't have gone if I had. My wife and I kept some cash out of the bank, kept our passports up to date, and were determined to leave for Canada if they ever mobilized my reserve unit. And in fact, there were so many people in my reserve unit who felt the same way that we used to talk about, we would charter a bus and all go to Canada together if they ever mobilized the reserve unit. So
That'd make a good movie.
Yep. So that's my story. Anyway, it was lovely being with you, and thank all of you for coming. And do go and buy